So as I said in the previous 5GHz Cantenna video, we're going to look at building a second Cantenna out of more readily available tin cans like these ones here. This one's got some tin fish in that, so this one, but I've cleaned it up and removed the label. These ones had some yeast in them, but basically the diameter is all the same with these cans. Now the diameter of these cans are around 53 millimeters, 54 millimeters. That's the inside diameter there, so it's a little bit bigger than the mathematics tells us we need for you know, a good working 5GHz Cantenna. So it's more than 10 millimeters bigger in diameter than what we really need. Now I'm going to build this one out of these cans, and I thought it would be a interesting video. Then we can test it next to the previous one that we built, more spot on to the mathematics. The mathematics tells us that the last one that I built out of the copper tubing at 42 millimeters, but the inside diameter was more like 39 millimeters. The mathematics tells us that that one should outperform one that we built out of this greater diameter, around 53 millimeters diameter. So it should be an interesting video, and these cans are more readily available to get your hands on, and they're easy to work with as well. They're easier to solder and easier to drill. Now I also want to point out that not all tin cans are designed the same way. Big volume items like baked beans and like these tins of soup here, these in the supermarket are designed to sit on cardboard trays, so they don't really sit on top of each other like so, and they're actually difficult to solder together, although I have got a method for soldering these together. I'll save that for another video. But low volume items like these two tins here have a recess at the base because they're not stacked up in the supermarket in volume, and they're designed to sit quite happily on top of each other, and these are much easier to solder because you can get your solder down in the ridge there, and you know, a lot stronger when you have soldered them as well. So if you look at these tin cans here that we're going to be working with, this is one that had yeast in. Now these ones come with a really nice top here, a lid that can snap back on, and we can use that to cover up the Cantenna rather than using the piece of cork that I would normally use. Now these are designed for the top can to sit in a ridge on top of that plastic cap, so soldering them together you've got the same sort of problem you'd have with baked bean cans and soup cans. It's a little bit tricky to solder them together because you don't have the you know, the space there for them to sit quite happily on top and then solder in between. But these tins of fish here, they have the ridge there, so they quite happily sit on top of each other because they're not a high volume item, so they're not designed to sit on cardboard trays. So you can basically get your solder in there, get some heat in there, and just work your solder into the groove around there, and you have a really good strong connection. So what I'm going to do is use one of the cans that had fish in, as well as one of these yeast cans here, and I can solder them up by getting my solder in that ridge there. So as I said, not all tin cans are the same, so look for the tin cans that have this nice ridge in here. Just makes it a lot easier to construct them. So I've tidied all the edges up where I want the solder to adhere to, so I'm just basically going to have them vertically on my bench like this. I'm going to use my small blowtorch, get some heat in there and flow some solder in that lip there, and then hopefully we've got a good connection between the two tins. So that's the soldering done, and it does make a really strong job. You're not going to pull these two tin cans apart anytime soon. I think all this black has come on here because I think there's some kind of clear lacquer on the can itself, so it's burnt that clear lacquer, but it's no big deal because we'll give it a light sand just before we paint it at the end anyway. Now as for the driven element, it's exactly the same as in the previous build, 15mm long, a quarter wavelength at 5 GHz, and the difference is I'm going to solder this SMA connector directly onto the tin this time. I'm not going to use screws, and it's positioned 21.5 millimeters away from the back reflector to take into account the extra diameter on the can here. So I've got the SMA connector soldered in place, and I've also soldered in place a nut so we can connect it to a tripod. I always forget the measurements of that nut because it's in imperial measurements, not metric, but I'll put a thing up on the screen now so you know exactly what kind of size it is to connect to a tripod. Basically just soldered it in place there. So first of all then, I'm going to do a scan with the original Cantenna just to remind ourselves how well that performs. So let's scan that one first. Let's have a look at that on the graph. You can see there it's about 57–58%, so it's pretty stable as well. There's no dropouts, just a constant nice strong signal there. So now we've reminded ourselves, let's hook up the second Cantenna then and see how well that performs against this one that's been made you know, specific to the measurements of what the waveguide maximum and minimums should be. So second scan then, this time with the can we've just made, where the optimal diameter is a little bit bigger than what it should be, so it should be interesting to see how it performs. And there it is at 58%, so let's have a look at that on the graph. So this one's a little bit different. It does seem to be just slightly under. It's around the same dB, but it's dropping out quite a lot and fluctuating. It's not as stable as the signal we're getting from the optimum Cantenna. So yes, when it does connect, it's producing about the same, but you can see there on the graph it's dropping in and out and fluctuating quite a lot, so you're not going to get a good connection with this one at all. And I'm letting this run on a little bit just to you know, see, but it's not improving any. We are getting a spike where it is getting around the 57–58% mark, but then it's also dropping down below 50% and also dropping out that signal as well. And it's interesting as well that it's also picking up two other access points. I've turned the Wi-Fi off in my lab this time, so that's not showing up on the like it did on the first test we did on the previous video. But because it's you know, a bigger diameter than the optimal for 5 GHz Wi-Fi, it's picking up a couple of other access points. It's picking up my 2.4 GHz Virgin Media signal as well as the 5 GHz. But yeah, it's when it works, it's producing around 56–58% signal strength, but it's totally unusable because it's dropping out and fluctuating so much you wouldn't be able to connect to that. So I've got the first Cantenna that I built hooked up to the spectrum analyzer here, and I've got it zoomed in so we can take a closer look at this frequency response. Now I'm zoomed in to the frequency response quite a bit normally than what I would normally do, but what we've got with the first one that we've built, we've got a really narrow frequency response, and that might be the reason why it blocks out everything else. I couldn't pick up a 2.4 GHz signal with this one, for instance, but you can see here it's extremely narrow. If I zoom back out a little bit, there's a second harmonic which I'll show you. So this is our frequency response here at 5 GHz. It's centered on 5 GHz there. It's a beautiful little response that we've got there, pretty low VSWR, but we've also got this second and this third harmonic here, so we're getting a good response further up the spectrum as well. That's probably around 5.8 GHz there, and then we're getting this one here that's probably not quite as good, but you can see how narrow this is, and that's probably the reason why it blocked out all those 2.4 GHz signals, like I said. And you know, it's not a wideband frequency response here, and it's pretty, dialed into the 5 GHz signal there. But you can see it's a very good response. And this is the second Cantenna here, and again we've got it fixed, centered on 5 GHz there, but we're not getting quite as good a response. The VSWR isn't as low on this one, but you can see how wide that and broadband the second one is, with having that wider diameter on the can. I mean, the driven element is exactly the same length, but because the can's much wider, we're getting a much wider broadband of operation on the spectrum with this second one, which is probably why it was also picking up those 2.4 GHz signal as well. It was letting the 2.4 GHz signal into the waveguide. Maybe that's why it didn't perform quite as well as the first one. And if you look at a wider image of the spectrum here, it's still centered on 5 GHz down the middle here, but we're getting all these secondary harmonics along here and along here, which we didn't get so much with the first one. The first one is probably more tuned to 5 GHz than this one is. So although both driven elements were the same size, the difference in the diameter of the cans does make a big difference in the performance of the Cantenna as a whole. And again, that's probably why it was letting in those 2.4 GHz signals. So the outcome from these two was a little bit unexpected. I didn't expect to see such a wide range in performance between the two. I was hoping, of course, that maths would win out and this one would be slightly better, but when you compare them both, I think possibly what's happening is that it's a similar sort of theory to how a bandpass filter works. A bandpass filter like this one here, you can feed in from your sweep generator several signals coming in here sweeping over a wide range, but it will only let in a certain amount of that frequency. This lets in 2 GHz to about 2.4 GHz, I think, maybe higher, maybe a little bit wider than that, but it only lets in a certain frequency range and blocks out all the rest. Now I think we've seen a similar thing between these two here, because this one will not pick up any 2.4 GHz signals, and I have got a lot around me here in the lab, whereas this one, even though the driven elements are the same, they're tuned for 5 GHz, this was picking up a couple of 2.4 GHz signals there, and I think that's maybe the reason why it didn't perform quite as well, and it was a little bit unstable. Maybe those signals it was picking up is interfering with this a little bit, and whereas this one that is a more precise diameter tuned to the mathematics of a waveguide, it wasn't letting any in at all. And I think possibly they were acting a little bit like a bandpass filter. So very interesting results then, not what I expected, but still making it more specific and sticking to the mathematics does prove to produce better results than something that's slightly bigger. And of course in these higher frequencies you would see big differences in performance with just a small diameter change of 10 millimeters, because small changes in the higher frequencies make much more of a difference to the lower frequencies. Probably if I just went on such a small diameter range on the 2.4 GHz frequencies, for instance, you wouldn't have seen so much of a dramatic change in performance or on the spectrum analyzer, but certainly at 5 GHz you do. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you've got any comments regarding how they both performed and whether you've got any other ideas what could be happening, please let me know in the comments, and I'll look into this a little bit more. I will make some more 5 GHz Wi-Fi antennas in the future, just to upgrade a few more on the channel, and any suggestions for antenna builds in the future that maybe you want to see, then drop them below in the comments. And if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.